The oxen stumble. The cart tilts. The golden box, the most sacred object in all of Israel, starts to slide. A man reaches out his hand, not to steal, not to defile, just to steady it, to keep it from falling. His fingers touch the gold, and in that instant, God strikes him dead. He collapses beside the very object he tried to protect. The celebration stops. The music dies. 30,000 people stand in stunned silence as a corpse lies in the dust next to the Ark of the Covenant. His name was Uzzah, and his death has troubled readers of the Bible for 3,000 years. Was God overreacting? Was Uzzah just trying to help? Or was something far deeper happening that we completely miss when we read this story casually? Welcome to Forgotten Scriptures, where we uncover the Bible's most shocking, violent, and controversial stories. Today we're diving into one of the most debated moments in all of Scripture, the instant death of Uzzah, a man who touched the Ark of the Covenant and paid for it with his life. This is a story that forces us to confront God's holiness, human presumption, and the deadly seriousness of approaching the sacred on our own terms. If you're ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about God's mercy and his wrath, hit that subscribe button right now. You're in Forgotten Scriptures. To understand why Uzzah died, we need to understand what the Ark of the Covenant actually was. This wasn't just a religious artifact or a fancy box. The Ark was the physical representation of God's throne on earth. It was a rectangular chest made of acacia wood, overlaid with pure gold, roughly 4 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and 2.5 feet high. On top sat the mercy seat, a solid gold lid with 2 cherubim facing each other, their wings spread over the cover. And it was between those cherubim, above the mercy seat, that the glory of God, the Shekinah. Inside the ark were 3 items: the 2 stone tablets inscribed with the 10 Commandments, a jar of manna from the wilderness, and Aaron's rod that had budded. These weren't random souvenirs. They represented God's law, God's provision, and God's appointed priesthood. The ark was the center of Israel's worship, the focal point of the tabernacle, and later the temple. When Israel traveled through the wilderness, the ark went first, leading them. When they crossed the Jordan River, the priests carrying the ark stepped into the water and it stopped flowing. When they circled Jericho, the ark was there. This object was the visible sign that God was with his people. But here's what's crucial. The ark wasn't meant to be touched, ever, by anyone. God gave extremely specific instructions about how it was to be transported. 4 gold rings were permanently attached to its corners, and 2 long poles made of acacia wood overlaid with gold were inserted through those rings. The poles were never to be removed. When it was time to move the ark, Levites from the family of Kohath and Only-Tem were to carry it on their shoulders using those poles. They were forbidden to touch the ark itself. Numbers chapter 4 makes it clear. After Aaron and his sons have finished covering the holy furnishings and all the holy articles, and when the camp is ready to move, only then are the Kohathites to come and do the carrying. But they must not touch the holy things, or they will die. Think about that command. They couldn't even look at it while it was being covered, and they absolutely could not touch it. The penalty for touching the ark was death, clear, explicit, no exceptions. This wasn't arbitrary. The ark represented God's holiness, and God's holiness cannot be approached casually, carelessly, or on human terms. It had to be treated with reverence, fear, and exact obedience to God's commands. Now let's meet Uzzah. He was the son of Abinadab, a man who lived in Kirioth, and Abinadab's house had a unique history with the ark. Decades earlier, the Philistines had captured the ark in battle, thinking it was just a war trophy, but God afflicted them with plagues and tumors until they couldn't wait to send it back to Israel. The ark ended up at Abinadab's house, where it stayed for about 20 years. Uzzah grew up with the ark in his house. He had seen it his whole life. It was familiar to him. And that familiarity, that comfort, that sense of, I know this object. That's part of what killed him. Fast forward to King David's reign. David has just conquered Jerusalem and made it his capital. Now he wants to bring the ark, the symbol of God's presence, into T. This is a brilliant political and spiritual move. Having the ark in Jerusalem would unite the nation, legitimize David's kingship, and center worship where he ruled. So David gathers 30,000 men, a massive assembly, and goes to Abinadab's house to retrieve the ark. But here's where the first mistake happens. Instead of calling the Levites to carry the ark on poles, as God commanded, David and his men place the ark on a new cart. They hitch oxen to the cart, and have Uzzah and his brother Ahio, sons of Abinadab, guide it. Why do they do this? Probably because that's how the Philistines transported the ark when they sent it back to Israel years earlier. The Philistines, who didn't know God's law, put it on a cart pulled by cows, and it worked fine for them. So David thought, if it worked for them, it'll work for us. But that logic was fatally flawed. The Philistines were pagans. They didn't have God's law. God didn't judge them for not knowing what they'd never been taught. But Israel had explicit, detailed, God-given instructions about how to handle the ark. David wasn't operating in ignorance. He was operating in convenience, in pragmatism, in doing what seemed easier and more impressive than obedience. So the procession begins. 30,000 people. Music everywhere. Harps, lyres, tambourines, cymbals, castanets. David and all Israel are celebrating with all their might before the Lord. It's a joyful, chaotic, triumphant parade, and the ark is bouncing along on a cart, being pulled by oxen over rough roads, heading toward Jerusalem. Then they reach a place called the threshing floor of Nachon. The ground is uneven. The oxen stumble. The cart lurches, and the ark of this golden box, representing God's throne, starts to tip. In that split second, Uzzah reacts. He reaches out his hand and grabs the ark to steady it. It seems so reasonable, so instinctive. The ark is about to fall. He's trying to save it. He's not stealing it, not mocking it, not desecrating it. He's helping, right? Wrong. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there beside the Ark of God. Instant death. No warning. No second chance. One touch, and Uzzah is dead on the ground. The celebration stops. The music dies. David is furious not at himself, but at God. The text says David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah. He names the place Perez Uzzah, which means outbreak against Uzzah. Then David becomes afraid. He says, "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" He's terrified to bring it into Jerusalem now. So he diverts the ark to the house of a man named Obed-Edom, where it stays for 3 months. And during those 3 months, God blesses Obed-Edom's household abundantly. Eventually, when David hears about the blessing, he gathers courage and tries again, but this time he does it right. He has the Levites carry the ark on poles, as God commanded. They sacrifice bulls and rams every 6 steps. David dances before the Lord with all his might, wearing only a linen ephod. This time, the ark enters Jerusalem safely, and there's a massive celebration. But Uzzah is still dead, and readers have been asking why. Ever since. Was God being unfair? Was the punishment too harsh? Let's unpack what was really happening. First, Uzzah's death wasn't about the physical act. Alone it was about the Hebrew word used is shal, which means carelessness, negligence, irreverence. Treating something sacred as common. Uzzah had grown up with the ark in his house. He was familiar with it. That familiarity bred. He forgot to never truly internalize that this wasn't just a box. It was God's throne. Touching it was approaching God's holiness in an unauthorized way, treating the sacred as if it were ordinary. Second, Uzzah's action revealed a heart issue. He trusted himself more than he trusted God. When the oxen stumbled and the ark tipped, Uzzah assumed it was his job to save it. He assumed God needed his help. He assumed that without his intervention, the ark, the throne of the creator of the universe, would be damaged. Think about the arrogance embedded in that assumption. The God who holds galaxies in place needs you to steady his throne. The God who spoke creation into existence can't protect a wooden box. Uzzah's reflex revealed that he didn't truly believe God was sovereign over his own presence. Third, the ark wasn't actually in danger. The text says the oxen stumbled, not that the cart collapsed. The ark was tipping. Yes, But God is fully capable of keeping it upright or letting it fall, and then restoring it without Uzzah's help. Just like Jesus was capable of calming the storm without the disciples' panic, God didn't need Uzzah's intervention. Uzzah's touch wasn't rescued, it was presumption. Fourth, this was a teaching moment for all of Israel. Uzzah died not just for his own sin, but to teach a lesson to 30,000 people watching. God's holiness is not negotiable. God's commands are not suggestions. You don't get to approach him on your terms, no matter how good your intentions are. The Israelites had been getting sloppy with holy things. They needed a stark, undeniable reminder that God is not tame, not casual, not safe. He is holy. Fifth, Uzzah was a Levite. He should have known better. This wasn't an outsider who didn't know the law. Uzzah's family had housed the Ark for years. He knew the rules, or sold Abby. His father was supposed to teach him. The Levites were supposed to instruct the people. Uzzah's death was judgment on generational neglect of God's commands. And finally, context matters. This wasn't an isolated moment of severity. This happened in a culture where God's holiness had been repeatedly violated, where the Ark had been mishandled and even captured, where Israel had been casual about worship for decades. Uzzah's death was a line in the sand. No more treating me as common. No more presuming on my grace. No more convenience over obedience. So what do we learn from Uzzah's shocking death? First, familiarity with sacred things doesn't equal intimacy with God. Uzzah grew up around the Ark. He saw it every day, and that familiarity made him careless. Today, we can grow up in church, hear sermons every week, read the Bible regularly, and still treat God casually. Exposure doesn't guarantee transformation. Familiarity can breed contempt or, at least, carelessness. Second, good intentions don't justify disobedience. Uzzah wasn't trying to defile the Ark. He was trying to protect it, but his good intention didn't make his action right. We do this all the time. We justify breaking God's commands because our motives are pure, our goals are noble, our results will be good. But God cares about obedience, not just outcomes. The ends don't justify the means. Third, presumption on God's grace is dangerous. Uzzah assumed God would overlook the violation because he was helping. We assume God will overlook our sin because we're basically good people, because we go to church, because we're trying our best. But grace is not permission to ignore God's holiness. Grace doesn't mean God doesn't care about obedience. Grace means that Jesus absorbed the judgment we deserve, but it doesn't mean there are no consequences for treating God's holiness lightly. Fourth, God's holiness is not a suggestion, it's reality. We live in a culture that has tried to redefine God as a cosmic buddy, a therapeutic counselor, a gentle grandfather who winks at sin. Uzzah's story shatters that illusion. God is holy, dangerously holy, consuming fire holy, untouchable holy, and when we forget that, we put ourselves in the same danger Uzzah faced. Fifth, how we approach God matters. The Ark had to be carried on poles by Levites on their shoulders. There was a right way and a wrong way. Today, there's still a right way to approach God. Through Jesus Christ, the true mercy seat, the one mediator between God and humanity. We don't get to invent our own path, our own rituals, our own theology. There's one way, and it's through the blood of Christ, in repentance and faith. Any other approach is presumption. And finally, Uzzah's death points forward to the cross. Uzzah touched God's throne and died instantly because God's holiness can't coexist with sin. But Jesus, the true Ark, the true presence of God, touched sinners constantly and made them clean instead of being defiled. Why? Because he was absorbing the judgment that sinners like Uzzah deserved. On the cross, Jesus became the place where God's holiness and God's mercy meet. He took the strike that should have fallen on us. Uzzah died beside the Ark because he treated it as common. We don't die when we approach God carelessly, not because God has lowered his standards, but because Jesus already absorbed the blow. That doesn't mean we can be casual. It means we should be even more reverent, more great, more awestruck that we're invited into the presence of a God so holy that one unauthorized touch used to mean instant death. The place where Uzzah died is still called Perez Uzzah. The outbreak against Uzzah, it's a permanent memorial to what happens when we forget that God is not like us, that his holiness is not negotiable, and that approaching him requires reverence, humility, and exact obedience to his revealed will. Next time on Forgotten Scriptures, we're diving into the New Testament for a story that feels like Uzzah's death all over again, but in a church service. A couple stands before the apostles with an offering. They smile. They claim to be generous. Eli. And within 3 hours, both of them are dead on the floor. You won't want to miss the shocking, terrifying story of Ananias. Ananias and Sapphira. If this story challenged you or made you rethink how you approach God, drop a comment and tell me. Do you think Uzzah's punishment was too harsh? What would you have done in his place? How does this story change the way you think about God's holiness? I want to hear your thoughts. And hit that subscribe button so you don't miss another episode of the most controversial, violent, and forgotten stories in the Bible. This is Forgotten Scriptures, where the Bible's darkest stories come to light.